The commissioner was smiling. That was the image. The one that appeared on the front pages and the broadcast opens and the social media thumbnails that millions of people encountered before they had decided whether they were going to engage with the story or scroll past it. A man in a suit, at a podium, with the particular smile of someone who has prepared for this moment and has decided that the prepared smile is the appropriate response to it. Behind that smile, according to the people who were in the rooms where the real conversations happened, was something that the cameras at the podium did not capture and that the prepared statements distributed to the media did not contain. A verdict had been delivered. Not in the language of verdicts. Not with the directness of a decision that announces itself honestly. In the language that institutions use when they have made a choice that they understand will not be received well and have decided that the packaging of that choice matters more than the transparency of it. Careful language. Measured language. The language of people who have consulted lawyers before speaking and who have decided that every word should be defensible rather than true. Shohei Ohtani received that verdict in a document. Mamiko read it first. To understand what the commissioner's office had been constructing in the weeks that preceded that document, you have to go back further than the injury. Further than the all-star withdrawal. Further than the 15-page medical record and the heavy bandaging and the device on his knee and all of the visible evidence of a body being asked to do something that no body had been asked to do before. You have to go back to the moment when Ohtani signed his contract. Not the ceremony of it. Not the press conference with the Dodgers uniform and the smiling executives and the astronomical number displayed on screens across the sports media landscape. The mechanics of it. The specific, granular, contractual mechanics of what was agreed to and what was not agreed to and what existed in the careful negative space between the things that were written down and the things that were understood. Professional sports contracts are not simply agreements between a player and a team. They exist within a framework. A framework constructed by the Commissioner's Office over decades of collective bargaining and legal precedent and the accumulated decisions of people whose job is to protect the structure of the game rather than any individual within it. That framework had something to say about Ohtani's situation. And what it had to say was not what Ohtani, or the Dodgers, or the millions of people who had watched him pitch and hit and transform the way the sport understood its own possibilities, had expected to hear. The verdict arrived on a Tuesday. Not a Monday, when important decisions are often made and communicated with the week stretching ahead to absorb the reaction. A Tuesday, which is the day that institutions choose when they have calculated that the news cycle will process the information more quietly than it would at the beginning of the week. It was delivered to the Dodgers front office first. Standard protocol. The organization before the individual. The people who manage the framework before the person the framework was being applied to. The GM read it at his desk. The same desk that had received the flat of Robert's palm a week earlier. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down and looked at the wall of his office for a period of time that his assistant, who was present, later described as longer than usual. Then he picked up his phone and called Roberts. Roberts came to the office. He closed the door. He read the document. The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes. Nobody outside that office heard it. But a staff member who passed the closed door twice during those 40 minutes said afterward that the tone that came through the wall was not the tone of two men processing a manageable complication. It was the tone of two men confronting something they had not seen coming and were now trying to determine how to respond to. The cruel element of the verdict was not its content alone. It was its timing. Ohtani was recovering. The 8-day adjustment to the internal timeline had reflected genuine medical progress. The inflammation was responding. The knee device was doing what it had been fitted to do. The daily assessments were producing the kind of numbers that medical staff circle and show each other with the quiet satisfaction of people whose projections are being validated by the reality of a patient who is healing correctly. He was coming back. Not immediately. But on a trajectory that had begun to feel, for the first time since the hospitalization, like something that could be trusted. And into that trajectory, the Commissioner's Office had inserted a document. The document addressed the question of Ohtani's two-way status in the context of his injury absence. Specifically, It addressed the conditions under which a player on the injured list for a pitching-related injury could return to active roster duties in a non-pitching capacity. The language was technical. Deliberately technical. The kind of technical that requires a lawyer to read it and a second lawyer to confirm what the first lawyer understood. What both lawyers understood, when the Dodgers' legal team had worked through it, was this: the commissioner's office was placing conditions on Ohtani's return to the batting lineup that had not existed before this injury. Conditions that were framed in the neutral language of player safety protocols but that had the practical effect of extending his absence from live game action beyond what the medical timeline required. He could be healthy enough to hit. The doctors could clear him to hit. The Dodgers could want him hitting. Ohtani could want to hit. And the commissioner's office could still say not yet. Mamiko was at the facility when the Dodgers representation sat down with Ohtani to walk him through the document. She had been coming every day. The access that Roberts had approved without deliberating, her presence in the building during his rehabilitation sessions, had become part of the daily structure of his recovery. She was not in the meetings. She was not in the training sessions. But she was in the building, in the particular way that someone who has wept in a hospital parking area and driven home with both hands on the wheel is present in a building. Available. Close. She was brought into the room when the document was being explained. This was not standard procedure. The meetings between players and organizational representation about contractual and regulatory matters do not typically include spouses. They include agents and lawyers and the relevant front office personnel and the player himself. The decision to include Mamiko was made by Ohtani. He asked for her to be there. The request was accommodated without discussion. She sat beside him while the lawyers explained what the commissioner's office had delivered. She asked one question. It was a short question. The people who were present have not repeated it publicly. But they have described the quality of the silence that followed it. The silence of people who have been asked something simple and direct in a room full of complicated and indirect language and who are now required to produce an answer that matches the simplicity and directness of the question. The answer was not satisfying. She did not respond to it immediately. She looked at the document on the table in front of her. She looked at it with the specific attention of someone who does not read English as their first language but who has learned to read the structure of documents. The shape of the paragraphs. The placement of the qualifications. The way important things are sometimes hidden inside the architecture of a sentence rather than stated in it. Then she broke down. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden, total collapse of someone overwhelmed all at once. The gradual, quiet kind. The kind that begins as a tightening around the eyes and becomes something the body can no longer contain. She covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders moved. Ohtani did not look at the lawyers or the front office personnel. He looked only at her. He placed his hand over hers on the table. The lawyers looked at the document. The commissioner continued smiling in public. He appeared at events. He gave interviews. He spoke about the health of the game and the growth of baseball internationally and the extraordinary opportunity that players like Ohtani represented for the sport's global expansion. He used Ohtani's name in contexts that positioned the commissioner's office as the steward of that expansion. As the institution that had created the environment in which what Ohtani was doing could happen. The people who had been in that room, who had watched Mamiko cover her face and watched Ohtani place his hand over hers and watched the lawyers study the document they had helped to construct, those people heard the commissioner's public words with a particular quality of attention. Not anger exactly. Something colder and more durable than anger. The recognition of the distance between the public face and the private one. Between the smile at the podium and the document on the table. Between the language of stewardship and the reality of a verdict delivered on a Tuesday to minimize the reaction. The entire country had seen the smile. Almost nobody had been in the room. That gap, between what was visible and what was real, between the prepared statement and the moment Mamiko's shoulders began to move, that gap was not an accident. It was the point. It had always been the point. And the people who understood that sat with it in the specific way you sit with something that cannot be unsaid and cannot be made smaller and that will not, regardless of how carefully the next press conference is managed, go back to being invisible. The commissioner was smiling. The document was still on the table.